Conditions are the backbone of Firebase rules, which are just statements that resolve to true or false. The Firebase rules environment contains a bunch of objects and helper methods that we can use to evaluate the incoming request, read other items in the database, check timestamps, and a bunch of other stuff. I don't want to overwhelm you with everything right away, so what we'll do now is look at a handful of very common examples that you'll very likely use in your own application. Let's start by developing an understanding of the general syntax, which should look familiar if you've worked with any modern programming language like JavaScript, Python, etc. We can start by adding the if keyword, and then some kind of logic that evaluates to either true or false. If we set it to false, it'll be a rule that always evaluates to false, which means the operation will always be denied. You should never have to make a rule like this explicitly, because that's the default behavior, but it's still a good thing to know. Now, in many cases, you'll need to check multiple conditions before allowing an operation. For example, you might need to check that a user is logged in, and that what they're trying to create has a timestamp that is not in the future. You can chain multiple conditions together using the logical AND operator. All the conditions chained here will have to evaluate to true in order for the rule to allow the operation. You can combine as many conditions as you need, but later in the course we'll look at how we can make this code a little more efficient and reusable. In addition, we have a logical OR operator. With the OR operator, only one of the conditions needs to be true in order for the rule to be allowed. An example might be checking whether or not a user is an admin, or they're added to some access control list that gives them the privilege to view this document. Now, there's a bunch of other operators that you might want to be aware of, but this is a good starting point for us. A more important concept to understand at this point is the difference between request and resource, which are two objects available to us in the rules environment. Request represents the incoming data from the client-side application. That means the user is trying to read or write something in the database, and we need to evaluate the information in that request to determine if it's valid. Request auth contains the JSON web token with the user's authentication credentials from Firebase. That's where you'll find things like the user ID, email address, or any custom claims that you set on the user's token. Next, we have the request resource, which is the actual data that the user is trying to write to the database. For example, when the user tries to create a new document, the resource will contain the actual data payload that the user wants to write. We can look at the data to make sure it's properly formatted in our rules before it gets committed to the database. From there we have time to check the time the request was submitted, then path, which represents the path in the database, and method, which is the method the user is trying to execute, like create, update, or delete. Now, in addition to the request object, we also have a global object called resource. And this object represents the data that already exists in the database, which is especially important when a user is updating or deleting a document. Now, keep in mind here that the resource is different than the request resource. The top-level resource is the existing data, while the request resource is the incoming data from the client that they want to commit to the database. A common security practice is to compare the incoming resource to the existing resource. For example, you might assign a username to a user when they first sign up, which is immutable and can't be changed in the future. Therefore, you might need a rule when the user updates their profile that checks the current username and validates that they're both the same. Now that you know some of the basics of the rules environment, let's look at a few very common examples.